The World Health Organization yesterday casting some doubt and causing some confusion about the spread of the coronavirus through asymptomatic infections. You heard a top WHO official calling asymptomatic transmission, quote, very rare, emphasizing it is not driving the spread of the virus. The new conclusion was drawn from new contact tracing data from several countries. However, preliminary evidence from the earliest outbreaks indicated the virus could spread from person-to-person contact, even if the carrier did not have symptoms. Now, the WHO says that while asymptomatic spread can occur, it is not the main way that it is being transmitted.
We have a number of reports from countries who are doing very detailed contact tracing. They're following asymptomatic cases, they're following contacts, and they're not finding secondary transmission onward. It's very rare. And that much of that is not published in the literature. From the papers that are published, there's one that came out from Singapore, looking at a long-term care facility. There are some household transmission studies where you follow individuals over time and you look at the proportion of those that transmit onwards. We are constantly looking at this data, and we're trying to get more information from countries to truly answer this question. It still appears to be rare that an asymptomatic individual actually transmits onward. What we really want to be focused on is following the symptomatic cases.
Well, welcome to this video. We're looking at what proportion of people who are infected with COVID-19 might be asymptomatic. Now, we know that 80% of people who get COVID-19 are reported to have a mild illness. They might just feel minimally unwell or a bit unwell for a few days and then recover. But we know that 20% get a more severe condition. 16% have a serious infection up to the point where they may need some hospital care and support. And we know that 5 or 6% become critically ill, and of course we know that perhaps 1% go on to die. But I did notice that recently Dr. Fauci in the States was saying up to 50% of infected people have no symptoms.
Sort out, because I think people's heads are spinning when the WHO says asymptomatic transmission is rare. We've been told for all these months now that part of the idea of staying at home is you could have coronavirus and not know it, and just the act of going out to a grocery store or a restaurant, you could be spreading it to people without knowing it. What did you make of the WHO comments yesterday?
Well, I think the official went overboard compared to what the actual official document, which I have here, said. So if you actually read the document carefully, it says that there are 3 studies that look at spread without symptoms. Part of the problem, and this is what they didn't make clear, is asymptomatic spread is when you never develop symptoms. You can only tell that at the very end. One of the things we know is that a lot of people are most infectious 1 to 3 days before they have symptoms. They look asymptomatic because they don't even know they have the disease, but they can still spread it. Well, they're not truly asymptomatic because they eventually develop symptoms, but they look asymptomatic. So if they were a little more careful, they would have said you can spread it when you're pre-symptomatic and then develop symptoms, and that makes it, yes, easier to trace, but people without symptoms can spread this disease. That's the important point. People who haven't developed symptoms yet, have the virus, can spread the disease, actually are most infectious, and then they can go on to develop symptoms. So we still do have to be very careful when people don't have symptoms, and go out with a mask, make sure that you're staying 6 feet away, because you could have the virus, you don't know yet, and you could develop symptoms. And that is a key problem. It was a very confusing statement.
Now, the South China Morning Post were quoting classified data, so we can't get this, but there's no reason to assume they're lying about it. China had found 43,000 asymptomatic infections through contact tracing. 43,000. In other words, what this is saying is that someone was known to have the virus. So the Chinese community health people, whether that person was known to have the virus, was symptomatic or not, doesn't matter. The point is someone was tested to have the virus, and then they looked at who their contacts were, who could have potentially been infected. And when they tested those contacts, they found out that 43,000 of those were asymptomatic. Now, it would have been nice to know this in January, I must say. When the Chinese became aware of this, we don't know. Maybe that's why that's classified. Though having said that, many of us were warning about this virus in January, so whether other governments around the world would have known. But certainly if we'd known that there was 43,000 asymptomatic people in China potentially spreading 100 billion viral particles a day each, that would have been useful information to have a long time ago. But we didn't have it, but now we have. And it's interesting. So were these people asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic? We're not told, but it looks like many were completely asymptomatic. So again, this Chinese data from the Chinese Morning Post is saying, well, many people have the virus, and we've tested 43,000 of them who turned out to have the virus but had no symptoms. Interesting. Now this, it's interesting to note, contradicts the World Health Organization assumptions. Now, up until recently, the World Health Organization was saying most transmission is driven by symptomatic individuals.
So I would note this. First, Dr. Birx sent me some new information before coming out here that new cases have stabilized, and many of the new cases are being identified through proactive monitoring and finding asymptomatic cases. Today, we saw the lowest new mortality report since the end of March, less than 500, and testing continues to expand with over 20 million done and more than 6% of Americans being tested, and in 7 states, nearly 10% of the population. So we are heading in a positive direction even as we begin to safely reopen.
But again, has the president seen anything that causes him concern?
I would note again the encouraging signs put forward by Dr. Birx. He's seen the country safely reopen, and I would also just note some of the media contradictions here, certainly not referring to you specifically, John, but just a little more broadly, that there isn't an outcry about social distancing among the protests. And I mean, I saw one network with footage of the Ozarks and complaining about social distancing in the Ozarks, and then seamlessly transitioning into protest footage and not suggesting that there was a problem with the lack of social distancing. So I think we have to be very consistent.
Now, up until recently, the World Health Organization was saying most transmission is driven by symptomatic individuals. And they were saying, in fact, I think they still are saying, asymptomatics are rare and not major drivers of transmission. Well, it looks like, if this data is correct, the World Health Organization have got it wrong yet again. That's what it looks like.
Go to the next slide. This is an article that I wrote a little while ago, and I called it Coronavirus Infections More Than the Common Cold. The reason is, up until recently, coronaviruses were like mild things. They were just common cold. Just next slide. In fact, those are all different kinds of viruses. The ones with the red circle around them are the 4 viruses that cause the common cold. That was until 2002. Then we got a big surprise, and the surprise was, next, is that we had the severe acute respiratory syndrome, and that was SARS. Multiple years later, we got the Middle East respiratory syndrome. But a story that you may remember, next slide. In China, in the Guangdong province, sort of history repeats itself, right, Mr. President.
Right.
In China, in the Guangdong province, there was this strange disease that came up that nobody knew what it was. The Chinese didn't really tell anybody about it for a few months, November until it got to Hong Kong. When it got to Hong Kong, next slide, in a hotel in Hong Kong, and this was way back in 2003, someone from China went to the hotel, infected a bunch of people, next slide. And this is what you had. You had flights going. At the time, we didn't make any restrictions the way you did, which I think saved us a really lot of hurt. Next slide. And then this is what happened. There were 8,000 cases, 774 deaths. And that's how I get the number that I've been telling you, that the mortality of SARS was about 9 to 10%. If you do that math, that's what it is.
Wow.
Right? Next slide. The other one is the MERS coronavirus, which was the one that was in Saudi Arabia. That was also from an animal reservoir. Next. In fact, it was from a bat. Next. From a bat to a camel, and then for the people in the Middle East who got it, that was the infection there. So these are the kind of things that go from an animal reservoir to a human. Sometimes it doesn't go anywhere. It just goes one or two people. But sometimes it adapts itself to function very, very, very efficiently. Next. And that's what happened. We had MERS coronavirus in Saudi Arabia. We had a few cases in the United States, but not many. And finally, next. This is where we are right now with the coronavirus. And then just getting back to the last, we got this sequence about a week after the Chinese were able to put it up on the board. And next. And then these are the things that we do, therapeutics, vaccines. So we'll stop there, but we'd really like to hear some comments from you, Mr. President.
Well, I want to thank you all. This is incredible, and I've heard about you, and I know all of you by name, and now I get to meet you. Unfortunately, I get to meet you because we're talking about this.